But the most extraordinary thing is that there are some people who do tell the truth during these terrible regimes.
Well, you know, when Lot and Abraham go to visit Sodom, Abraham bargains with God because God's going to take Sodom out. And Abraham says, because God says, the whole city's corrupt. And Abraham says, well, what do you mean, the whole city? You mean everybody? And God says, yeah, pretty much. And Abraham says, well, if there's 40 men there that aren't corrupt, will you spare the city? God says, yeah, okay. And then Abraham says, well, how about 30? And God says, you're pushing your luck, but yes. And then he says 20, and finally he bargains God down to 10. Right, and what that means is that, I think what it means is that if 10 people can still tell the truth, there's hope. Once you get below that, if it's none, well, then you're in hell, right? And then you know, the fire and brimstone will definitely rain down on your city. That's comedians, right? The comedians, they can tell the truth. And if there doesn't have to be very many people who can still put their head up above the parapet and say, here's something funny and true, you know, very few people. So
let's talk about some of those cases, and I think they're really interesting. Solzhenitsyn is someone I'm sure you know a lot about. Maybe you can talk about what inspired him and what happened to him, but also
he took responsibility for his condition. You know, when he was in the Gulag, Solzhenitsyn had every reason to be a victim, because the reason he was in the Gulag was because of Hitler and Stalin. And so if you need someone to blame, man, those are two credible perpetrators. But Solzhenitsyn asked himself, he saw two things. He saw in the prison camps that there were religious believers who conducted themselves nobly under impossible conditions. And that really made him think. And then he realized too that the prisoners were running the camps. Right? So people were enslaved by their own slavishness. And then he started to think, well, maybe the way I lived my life had something to do with why I ended up here. And by doing that, he did what Dostoevsky recommended people do. Dostoevsky said, every man is responsible not only for everything that happens to him, but for everything that happens to everyone else. Now that's a crazy thing to say. But not exactly. And the reason for that is, if you followed the gospel injunction, let's say, if you were perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect, how much better would the world be? And the answer is, you don't know. Like, if you were the most glittering, shining example that you could possibly be, how much good could you do? And the answer, again, well, that's what your life's for, is to find that out. And so the fact that things are shaking and rocking, how much your sin is associated with the fact that everything shakes and rocks is a completely open question. And I think the world is actually constituted so that everything that happens is every individual's fault. You know, and that goes along with the idea that each person has a spark of the divine within them that shouldn't be hidden, that you hide to your peril and to the peril of the world. Now, it's a strange metaphysical idea, but that doesn't really bother me, because life is no shortage of strange. So,
even more perhaps extraordinary than the story of Solzhenitsyn, and maybe you disagree with this, is the case of Hans and Sophie Scholl, the siblings in Nazi Germany. They were only teenagers at the time, who were part of the White Rose movement, and they printed these leaflets that were very much criticizing the Nazi regime at a time when very, very, very few Germans were willing to do that. Mm-hmm. Very few German adults were willing to do that. Mm-hmm. But they were willing to do that. They were Christian, they had deeply held moral beliefs. And the way that they died, people speculate, we don't know why they did it in the end, but they handed out these leaflets in a school, and they did it in a very obvious way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the janitor at the school dobbed them in and sent them to the SS, and they were killed very, very quickly for a kangaroo court and everything else. Can you talk about their case? What makes them special? How did they, as children, react in a way that we would find so inspirational when so many of their adults around them failed in that sense?
Well, tracing out the causal pathway to courage is not a simple thing, right? I mean, I've seen people who've led lives of bitter misery by any standard, who did everything they could to be good people despite that. You know, and had they become psychopathic criminals, the sociologists would have said, well, of course, look at the conditions of their existence. But I've met people who've been brutalized beyond comprehension, who decided nonetheless that they would aim up, tell the truth. Now, why are people capable of that? That's an eternal mystery. You know, the Judeo-Christian doctrine is that we have free will. And I think that's true. Now, that doesn't mean I understand it. And I know that the relationship between free will and determinism is complex, and that certain aspects of our action are explicable in a deterministic manner, but not in the final analysis. And partly the reason for that is that a deterministic organism can't compute the transforming horizon of the future. So, because the future is actually unpredictable. So a deterministic mechanism can't adapt to it. But in any case, people make their choices, and God only knows how early you start doing that. It's very early. You know, Carl Jung, when he was talking about the Oedipal complex, so for Freud, the Oedipal complex in some ways was top down, right? So a mother would be a smothering mother, would offer too much dependence and overwhelm her child. But for Jung, it was more like a dance of agreement. And so imagine a 6-year-old in bed, and maybe he has, I don't know, maybe he's a bit dehydrated, so he's got a headache. But really, he's upset because he didn't do his homework. And his mom comes downstairs, and maybe she's a bit lonesome because she's had a scrap with her husband for the 50th time that week. And she thinks, you know what, I wouldn't mind having the company. And the kid thinks, I wouldn't mind not going to school today. And the kid says, Mom, you know, my head sort of hurts. And the mom says, well, dear, you know, maybe you don't need to go to school today. And the kid thinks, well, really, I don't want to go to school because I didn't do my homework. And the mom thinks, really, I want the kid home because I'm lonesome. And they both think, yeah, we just won't say that part out loud. Right, and so is the kid making a moral choice? Yeah, we start making moral choices. God only knows how early. Unbelievably early. You know, terrifyingly early, I would say. And, you know, why do some people end up courageous when so many don't? It's easier not to be. You know, it's easier to cut corners and not bear your responsibility, not take the opportunities that manifest themselves to you, not pay for your sins in the moment. It's easier. And so there's 1,000 or 1,000,000 ways that you can be dishonest. But some people, you know, they're paragons of virtue. And we've argued about that forever. The Calvinists thought that was predestination, right? It's the grace of God. I don't know how to explain it. It looks like choice to me. You know, in the famous picture of God reaching down to Adam in the Vatican on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you see God reaching down and you see Adam reaching up, although not with a lot of effort, really sort of languorously. But the existence is constituted in that manner, is that things offer themselves to us, but we have the choice about whether to receive them. And some people decide to stretch their hands out with a bit more effort and humility, and some people decide to take the easier path.